Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, Daquin, China Views the West. Medieval Europeans knew that China existed. Well, they knew there was a place out there that silk came from, and they called it Ceres or Serica, both of which mean land of silk. There are records of several groups attempting to make contact between the Roman and Chinese empires. It might be said fairly that the Chinese had better information about the Romans than the converse, although their information was still derived through intermediaries. It must be noted that being the state that lies between Constantinople and China is a valuable role, and those who had it took pains to ensure that the ambassadors going from one to the other were prevented from achieving success. A Chinese army reached the Caspian Sea in 97 AD, and one of its officers was sent as an ambassador to Daquin, that is, Rome, but turned back at the shore of the Black Sea due to stories he was told about the length of the journey. His name was Gan Ying, and excerpts of his reports can still be found. His son also wrote a book called The Records of the Western Regions. The Chinese general who marched to the Caspian Sea set up a series of fortresses there, and these remained in Chinese hands for some time. The armies of Trajan, in the westernmost march into Parthia, came within a day of these garrisons. There are stories, which lack archaeological evidence that is broadly accepted, that Romans were taken prisoner by the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae and were shipped east as warrior slaves to man the Chinese border. These men are said folkloristically to have founded a city called Daquin, which is Alexandria. Note that this is not the same as any of the many other cities founded by Alexander himself. He did create a city called Alexandria Escate, which means Alexandria the furthest, and that was in Fergana. The descendants of his army were found all over northern India in ancient times, and some even settled as far away as Sri Lanka. In Homer Dubs's History of the Former Han Dynasty, we find this story, quote, "Between 110 and 100 BC, there arrived at the Chinese capital an embassy from the king of Parthia. Among the presents to the Chinese emperor are stated to have been fine jugglers from Daquin. The jugglers and dancers, male and female, from Alexandria in Egypt, were famous and exported to foreign countries. Since the king of Parthia obviously esteemed highly the emperor of China, he naturally sent the best jugglers he could secure. When these persons asked whence they came, they of course replied from Alexandria, which were the Chinese, who disliked polysyllables and initial vowels and could not pronounce certain Greek sounds, shortened to Daquin. When they also learned that this place was different from Parthia, the Chinese naturally used its name for the country of these jugglers. No Chinese had been to the Roman Empire, so they had no reason to distinguish a prominent place from the country itself. The Romans, moreover, had no name for their empire other than Orbis Terrarum, that is, the world, so that these jugglers would have found it difficult to explain the name of the Roman Empire. In such a fashion, there probably arose the Chinese name Daquin, which for them denoted the Roman Empire in general." End quote. Note, Dubs was writing in 1957. The archaeology has moved on since. Modern genetic testing around Daquin does not seem to support Roman ancestry for the people there. In 166, a group claiming to be ambassadors from Rome appeared in the Chinese court. They had come by sea from the south, which is technically possible because at that time the Romans had Egyptian and Red Sea trade ports which linked into the Indian trade network, and the Indian trade network linked into the Chinese one. The goods they offered the emperor seemed to be from Southeast Asia, so there is some question as to the accuracy of their credentials. Liang Shu notes, during the 5th year of the Hongwu period of the reign of Sun Quan, which is about 226, a merchant of Daquin, whose name was Qin Lun, came to Tongking, and the prefect of Zhaoxi, Wei Miao, sent him to Sun Quan, the Wu emperor, who asked him for a report on his native country and its people. Qin Lun prepared a statement and replied, "At the time, Zhu Qi chastised Dan Yang, and they caught blackish-coloured dwarves. When Quinlan saw them, he said that in Daquin these men were rarely seen. Sun Quan then sent male and female dwarves, 10 of each, in charge of an officer, Liu Zan, to accompany Quinlun. Liu Zan died on the road, whereupon Quinlan returned direct to his native country. In the 3rd century, there was a book in China about the products to be found in the Western countries. Link to a translation can be found in the show notes. There are at least 2 embassies that claim to be from Rome that arrive in the imperial court in the 3rd century. Rome collapses in the 5th century and Chinese power wanes after the 7th. This creates a power vacuum and the Silk Road declines, which in turn cuts communications between each side. As the Mongol Empire expands, it stabilizes the Silk Road, which permits Chinese people to reach back out towards Rome to see what's there. They are remarkably well informed. For example, Chinese maps from the 13th century and Korean maps from the 14th century show many of the features of Europe. These are also included in the show notes.